Have you ever thought about what it means to stand up for something? Webster's dictionary tells us that to stand up is to remain sound and intact under stress, attack, or close scrutiny. This is what we do when we really, truly believe in something, whether it's our country or our child, or, as I'm going to talk about today, the idea of Christian Science healing. We live in a scientific age, and most people today are accustomed to thinking of health and healing exclusively in terms of medical science. But for over 100 years, Christian scientists all over the world have been standing up for the idea of spiritual healing, the kind of healing that Jesus and his earliest disciples practiced. And they've done it under circumstances that were sometimes stressful. Now, why do they do this? It's because they found that it works in their lives. It's effective. Today, I'm going to tell you about an instance in my life when I watched a loved one stand up for the idea of Christian healing. And we watched as what looked to be a serious physical condition resolved quickly and completely. And I'll tell you why it's safe to stand up in this way. But first, I want to introduce you to two people who stood up to giants. The first one is Mary Baker Eddy. She was the discoverer and founder of Christian Science, and she was the author of Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. Mary Baker Eddy stood up to entrenched ideas about the nature of God and the basis of health. She stood up to the giant notion that the universe is material and that matter determines our health, our happiness, even our self-worth. Now, the second person that I'm going to tell you about is someone that you may know from the Bible, the young shepherd boy David, who stood up to the giant Goliath. His was a physical giant. Now, we're going to talk more about David later, but here's what you need to know about David for now. David did not allow the size, the ferocity, or the reputation of the giant to keep him from making a stand. So let's go back for just a moment and talk a little bit more about Mary Baker Eddy. She was an American woman born in 1821. It's an important thing that you know about Mary Baker Eddy, that she was one of those people who stood for the love of God from the very beginning. Even as a very little girl, she had this deep spiritual desire to really know God. And her love for God was so deep, it was reflected in her love for all of those around her. Even as a tiny little girl, she healed the barnyard animals in her family's New England farm. When she was just 5, her older brother had an accident with an axe. It seemed to be a serious injury. Mary's father had witnessed how the barnyard animals had been healed. So he called for Mary, and when she came, he placed her little hand right on the wound. Soon, a doctor arrived, and he saw that the bleeding had stopped completely and the wound was beginning to close. He said he had never seen an injury like that heal so rapidly. This was just a hint of what was about to happen in Mary Baker Eddy's life. Later, she would learn that spiritual healing is not magic. It's the natural outcome of the constant recognition of God's love for all of his children. When she was a young teenager, Mary Baker Eddy was interviewed for membership in her family's congregational church. Now, I'm going to go back just a little bit on this and tell you that in her home, the Bible was constantly read and discussed. Her mother had such a deep sense of God's love, and she had taught Mary to lean on God's pure love. But her father was a strict Calvinist, and her father believed in the doctrine of predestination, that some people were destined for eternal salvation while others were destined for everlasting punishment. So when Mary was interviewed for membership in her family's church, she said to the pastor that she could never believe in that doctrine. But she loved the church. And the members of the church were so impressed by her sincerity that they admitted her to membership. Mary stood firm. She stood for the fact of God's impartial love for all of his children. Throughout her life, she stood up for the fact that God has no favorites, that no one is left out, no one is incurable, no one is beyond help. This was one of many giants that she would stand up for. Goliaths, such as poor health, widowhood, divorce, even the loss of the custody of her child. Her life was far from easy. Her health was fragile, and this caused her to reach out and explore many different methods of healing. But she had a breakthrough moment in her 40s. She was healed of the effects of a serious accident through spiritual means alone. She said that this was the falling apple that led me to the discovery of how to be well myself and how to make others so. But she didn't leave it at the falling apple. For decades, she searched the scriptures, asking the question, how did Jesus heal? What is so significant about Mary Baker Eddy is the way she thought about Jesus' life and works. She did not see him as a miracle worker, but as a scientific thinker and healer. She knew that the power behind his works was the Christ, which she defined in part as his divine nature, the godliness which animated him. The Christ is always available. The Christ is always present, and the Christ heals. Jesus was a man of truth. He said to his disciples, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." What is that truth that Jesus taught? Mary Baker Eddy's deep study of the scriptures and her love for Christ Jesus led her to this understanding. First, that God is all. There is nothing but God. He has no opposite, and he does not include one single element of evil. Second, that God is impartial and universal, always available to all of his children. And third, that God is spirit, and that he made man in his own image and likeness. So man must be absolutely spiritual, entirely good. These ideas came out of Mary Baker Eddy's practice as a Christian healer. there are hundreds of documented healings from her long career as a healer. She healed cancer and consumption, blindness and deafness and insanity, and she taught others to heal. She taught that all real healing is based on an understanding of what Jesus said and did. In other words, the science of Christianity. In these days, she was able to bring out radical new ideas. Throughout her life, she loved the Bible, and she turned to the Bible as the source and authority for her practice and her writing. She was that radical new thinker who brought out things that would challenge the mainstream thought. Sometimes she must have felt like David going out to meet Goliath. She wrote, "Materialistic theories challenge, materialistic hypotheses challenge metaphysics to meet in final combat. In this revolutionary period, like the shepherd boy with his sling, woman goes forth to battle with Goliath." So now let's talk for a minute about David and Goliath. The Bible account of David and Goliath is a classic example of someone who stood up to evil and triumphed, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It reminds us that there is no problem so big or scary or complex that it can't be faced and challenged and conquered. Now, just in case you're not familiar with the story of David and Goliath, let me sketch in the story for you for just a little bit. Goliath was a giant. The Bible says he was over 9 feet tall, and he had slaughtered every mighty man of war who came out against him. He had challenged the army of Israel to send just one man to fight him. But of course, nobody was very interested in that certain death until the young shepherd David stepped forward. Well, defeat seemed certain. Goliath was a giant, over 9 feet tall. He had beaten every mighty man of war who came out against him. David was just a kid. He was the guy who kept the sheep. But when Goliath taunted him, David stood firm. This is what he said. "You have come to me with a sword and spear and dagger, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the army of Israel, whom you have defied. The Lord will put you into my power this day." Now, how could David stand up so confidently against this giant? It was because he knew that the source of his power and his authority was God. He knew that his strength was not some personal possession that might or might not measure up. So he was fully confident to go out against Goliath in the name, in the nature of God. We can do this too. When we stand up to our problems, even the big scary ones, in the nature of God, all of God's power and authority stand with us. David rejected the sword and spear approach. Instead, he chose 5 smooth stones from a nearby brook and a simple sling. Then he took one of those stones and he slung it fearlessly toward the giant. It hit him right in the forehead, killing him instantly. The threat was eliminated quickly and completely. Now, it's important to know that everybody has to choose his own smooth stones. I think about those stones as 5 concrete thoughts that I can turn to when my problems seem overwhelming, like a Goliath. Now, everybody has to choose his own smooth stones. But just as an example, here are 5 smooth stones that have been really helpful to me when I've been overwhelmed with fear. First, my no-name stone. Don't be afraid of the name of a problem. Instead, call it nothing. No thing. And know why it's no thing. That's because God is pure, infinite good. And he can't create something that is completely unlike himself. Second, my no place stone. Know that the problem doesn't have a place to be. Now that's because God already fills all space. When I was just a tiny little girl, I learned these wonderful words. There is no spot where God is not. So there's no spot where good is not. No spot for pain or fear or disease to reside. Third, my no cause stone. Often, when we have a problem, our first impulse is to wander around mentally searching for a cause. Instead, know that the problem has no cause. Now, why is that? That's because God, infinite good, is the one great and only cause. And the God who is infinite good could only cause infinite good. Next, my no course to run stone. Sometimes when we're faced with a problem, our fear isn't about what's happening at that moment. Our fear is about the course that we think the problem might run. How long will it last? Will one symptom lead to another? But progress belongs to God. So only good can progress, and only good has form and pattern. And finally, my no fear stone. You don't have to be afraid. God is infinite mind. He's the only mind, and he is your only mind. And he knows nothing that is mindless or destructive. Now let's think about it for a minute. What are some of the Goliaths in your life? What are the problems that seem so big and complex and long-standing that you don't know how to begin to approach them? Are you going to do it with a sword and a spear and a dagger? Are you going to do it with a raised fist or a raised voice? If we do, we're beaten before we begin. Why? Because we're fighting in the wrong arena. But what if we change the arena? What if, instead of starting with the problem, we start with the infinite power of good? Mary Baker Eddy's healing work was effective because she started in the right arena. She refused to use matter to try to make better, healthy, more abundant matter. Instead, she began with the basic premise that God is all and God is good, and man is his image and likeness. So man must be totally good. About 20 years ago, our family had to make a decision about what arena we would fight in when my mom had a serious accident. We chose to rely on God completely for healing. Now, these days, people often only turn to God when almost everything else has failed. Maybe that's because they think of God as very far removed from their everyday life. And maybe it's because they think that God has created other means of healing and that we should try all of those and turn to God completely only after that has failed. Is it safe to turn to God first for healing? Jesus did. Mary Baker Eddy did. And here's how my mom did. We were on a family vacation when my mom was thrown from her horse. She was clearly in a lot of pain, and she couldn't get up. So our wrangler called to the ranch where we were staying and asked if they would send a truck to pick us up. While we waited for the truck, my mom and I sat on the ground praying as we had learned to do in Christian Science. We began our prayer with the acknowledgement that God is always present and that He always cares for His children, that His good is stable, it doesn't come and go. We knew that no matter what it looked like, divine love was right there on the scene, and love was standing up for us. Soon, the truck arrived from down in the valley, and my mom was lifted up into the front seat, and I slid in beside her. As we rode down that mountain, we prayed together, and we stayed so clear and persistent in our acknowledgement that God was present, that God was loving her. We knew that we could stand confidently for the truth. The next day, there was clear improvement, but my mom still couldn't stand up on her own. So the manager of the ranch came to our cabin. She asked if Mom would be willing to go to the hospital and have some x-rays made, and my mom agreed. At the hospital, the doctors told us that Mom's hip was fractured in 3 places and that surgery would be necessary. But that couldn't happen until some swelling went down, and that might take a few weeks. So my mom told them that she'd prefer to spend those weeks at home. Soon she was on her way. Early on, it became clear to us that my mom's ability to stand had nothing to do with muscles and bones. What was really needed was a firm mental stand. We stood for the fact that God is always present and that He always cares for His children. And we stood up for God's good name, for His complete control over all of His ideas everywhere. As we prayed, we were inspired to sing all of the hymns in the Christian Science hymnal that include the word stand. Now, this is no small feat. There are 19 of them. But my mom sang all 19 with great gusto and joy. I know this because she made a recording for me, which I still cherish today. These hymns inspired my mom with a new sense of strength. It was the strength of conviction. And a wonderful thing happened. When she had finished singing all 19 hymns, my mom stood up. She stood in God's great might. She stood for the fact of God's ever-present intelligence, and that displaced the mental image of random, out-of-control activity that we call an accident. She stood for God's sweet, tender love for all of His creation, and that mental posture relieved her pain. And she stood for the fact that she was not just a bundle of muscles and bones and flesh. She was God's spiritual idea, always intact. And after she stood, she walked. First with a walker, then with a cane, but every day with more strength and grace and freedom. The surgery that was called for was never needed. And 30 days later, my mom and dad went on a cruise together. And on that trip, my mom walked and swam and even danced with great joy. Of course, every healing is unique. And each one has to find his own inspiration. But sometimes it's a very good thing to remind ourselves to just stand up to the problems that confront us. We are not helpless victims. We have a choice. And when we choose to stand with God, all of God's power and grace and love stand with us. We're free, and we know it. Divine love, the same love that supported David as he ran out to meet Goliath, the same love that supported Mary Baker Eddy as she stood up to the Goliath of material assumptions, the same love that supported my mom as she stood up and stood for her healing in Christian Science. That very same love is supporting you right here, right now. Stand up for your real identity as the child of God. Stand up for your health and your freedom and your love and your joy. And know that God's gracious, omnipotent hand is upholding you always. Stand up for healing. Thank you.